There's something uniquely satisfying about the moment when people who think they have you figured out realize they've been playing checkers while you've been playing chess. When my son Thomas leaned across the Thanksgiving table and loudly declared that I was losing it and needed to be put somewhere safe, I didn't argue or get upset. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I simply smiled, set down my fork, and announced that I had some wonderful news to share about the $15 million they'd all been counting on inheriting. The silence that followed was so complete, you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, and the look of absolute horror on their faces told me everything I needed to know about what they really thought of their dear old mother. I never imagined I'd reach 73 years old and have to prove my mental competence to my own children, but life has a way of surprising us all. My name is Margaret Caldwell, though everyone has always called me Maggie, and if you ask anyone in Portland's construction industry, they'll tell you I helped build half this city alongside my late husband Frank. We started Caldwell Construction, on development in 1981 with nothing but a borrowed pickup truck, Frank's carpentry skills, and my head for numbers. 43 years later, our company has erected some of the most recognizable buildings in the Pacific Northwest, and our family trust holds assets worth more than most people see in several lifetimes. I grew up during a time when women didn't typically run businesses, but Frank never saw me as anything less than his equal partner. While he handled the construction crews and job sites, I managed the books, negotiated contracts, and made the investment decisions that turned our small operation into a regional powerhouse. When Frank passed away 8 years ago after a sudden heart attack, I took over as sole owner and CEO, much to the surprise of our 3 adult children who had assumed the business would naturally pass to Thomas, our eldest. Thomas has always been the golden child in his own mind, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, but lacking Frank's humble work ethic. At 48, he carries himself with the confidence of someone who's never really failed at anything, mostly because I've spent decades quietly cleaning up his mistakes and ensuring his success. He graduated from Portland State with a business degree that I paid for, married Ashley, a sweet girl from a good family, and has worked at Caldwell Construction for 20 years without ever truly understanding how the company operates beyond his role in sales and client relations. My daughter Linda, 2 years younger than Thomas, took a different path entirely. She married Patrick Brennan, a successful dentist, and settled into the comfortable life of a professional's wife. Linda has always been more interested in the social aspects of wealth than the responsibility that comes with it. She serves on several charity boards, organizes fundraising galas, and has perfected the art of looking busy while accomplishing very little of substance. Her main contribution to family gatherings has traditionally been planning elaborate menus and ensuring our Thanksgiving china is properly displayed. Daniel, my youngest at 42, has spent most of his adult life trying to find himself. He's attempted careers in everything from organic farming to artisanal furniture making, each venture funded by generous checks from the family account. Unlike his siblings, Daniel has never shown much interest in the construction business, preferring to pursue what he calls authentic work that doesn't require him to wear a suit or keep regular hours. He's unmarried, lives in a converted warehouse in Southeast Portland, and creates metal sculptures that sell for modest amounts at local galleries. The irony of my current situation is that for 40 years, my children have relied on my judgment for everything from major business decisions to choosing their children's schools. When Thomas wanted to expand into commercial real estate development, he came to me for approval and funding. When Linda needed money for her kitchen renovation, she knew exactly who to ask. When Daniel's latest artistic endeavor required a workshop space, I quietly arranged for him to rent one of our company properties at below-market rates. Yet somehow in the past year, they've all decided that I'm no longer capable of managing my own affairs. The transformation in their attitudes began subtly, as these things often do. It started with small comments about my forgetting names or repeating stories, observations that any 73-year-old might expect from younger family members. Thomas began speaking to me more slowly, as if I couldn't understand normal conversation. Linda started checking up on me more frequently, dropping by the house unannounced to see how I was managing. Daniel, in his awkward way, began asking if I needed help with basic tasks like grocery shopping or paying bills. At first, I attributed their concern to love and natural worry about my advancing age. Frank and I had raised them to be caring, responsible people, and it seemed natural that they would want to ensure my well-being as I entered my golden years. But gradually, their concern began to feel more like surveillance, and their helpful suggestions started sounding like directives from people who had already decided what was best for me. The breaking point came 6 months ago during a family meeting about the company's future. I had called everyone together to discuss some strategic changes I wanted to implement, including a significant expansion into sustainable building practices and renewable energy integration. The construction industry was evolving rapidly, and I knew we needed to adapt or risk becoming obsolete. I had spent months researching new technologies, consulting with industry experts, and developing a comprehensive business plan that would position Caldwell Construction as a leader in green building practices. When I presented my proposal, the response was not what I had expected. Instead of engaging with the substance of my ideas, Thomas immediately began questioning whether I had really thought through the implications of such a major change. Ashley suggested that perhaps I should consider stepping back from day-to-day operations and letting Thomas take over the company leadership. Linda wondered aloud whether the stress of running a business was becoming too much for someone my age. Even Daniel, who I thought would appreciate the environmental focus of my proposal, seemed more concerned about my mental state than excited about the company's potential new direction. What hurt most was the way they looked at each other during my presentation, exchanging glances that clearly communicated their shared belief that I was no longer thinking clearly. They had apparently been discussing my supposed decline behind my back, comparing notes on my alleged forgetfulness and building a case for why I could no longer be trusted to make sound decisions. The business plan I had worked so hard to develop was dismissed not on its merits, but because they had already decided I was becoming incompetent. That meeting marked the beginning of what I now think of as the campaign to declare me unfit. Suddenly, every minor memory lapse became evidence of cognitive decline. When I couldn't immediately recall the name of a subcontractor we hadn't used in 5 years, it was proof I was losing my mental sharpness. When I asked Helen, my housekeeper, to help me find my reading glasses, Thomas suggested it might be time to consider hiring a full-time caregiver. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I mentioned the same funny story twice during a family dinner, Linda began researching memory care facilities. The most frustrating part was how they seemed to interpret my normal aging process as evidence of incompetence while completely ignoring the fact that I was still successfully running a multi-million-dollar business. Caldwell Construction had its most profitable quarter in company history just 3 months ago, largely due to contracts I had personally negotiated. Our expansion into sustainable building practices, which I had championed despite their skepticism, was attracting new clients and positive media attention. Yet none of these successes seemed to register with my children, who were apparently too focused on cataloging my perceived failures to notice my continued achievements. Helen Rodriguez has been my housekeeper and companion for 12 years, ever since Frank's health began declining. She's a sharp woman in her 50s who emigrated from Mexico with her family when she was young and worked her way through community college while raising 3 children as a single mother. Helen sees everything that happens in my household, and she's been growing increasingly uncomfortable with how my children treat me during their visits. She's witnessed their patronizing tone, their habit of talking about me as if I weren't in the room, and their assumption that she would naturally side with them in any concerns about my well-being. What my children don't realize is that Helen and I have developed a close friendship over the years that goes far beyond an employer-employee relationship. She's the one person in my life who still treats me exactly the same way she always has, neither dismissing my concerns as age-related confusion nor patronizing me with false cheerfulness. When I needed someone to confide in about my growing frustration with my family's attitude, Helen was there to listen without judgment and offer perspective based on her own experiences with family dynamics. Helen was the first person to point out that my children's sudden concern about my mental state seemed to coincide perfectly with their increased interest in their inheritances. She noticed that conversations about my supposed decline often led to discussions about the trust funds I had established for each of them and their children. She observed that Thomas had been asking more detailed questions about the company's financial structure, and that Linda had been making comments about how difficult it must be for me to keep track of all my various investments and accounts. The trust funds themselves represent the fruits of 40 years of hard work and careful financial planning. Frank and I had always intended to leave our children financially secure, but we also wanted to ensure they learned the value of work and responsibility before inheriting significant wealth. The funds are structured to provide comfortable annual distributions while preserving the principal for future generations, and they include provisions for larger distributions for specific purposes like buying homes, starting businesses, or covering educational expenses for the grandchildren. Over the years, my children have all benefited substantially from these arrangements. Thomas received a significant distribution when he wanted to buy his current house in the West Hills, and the fund has supplemented his salary to provide his family with a lifestyle far beyond what his actual job performance would support. Linda has used her distributions to maintain her social activities and supplement Patrick's dental practice income during slower periods. Daniel's artistic pursuits have been largely subsidized by his fund, allowing him to pursue his creative interests without worrying about earning a living wage. But apparently, the annual distributions weren't enough anymore. As I began paying closer attention to their conversations and behaviors, I realized that all three of my children were counting on eventually inheriting the full principal amounts of their trusts, plus their share of the company and other family assets. They had been making financial decisions based on the assumption that significant wealth would eventually come their way, and my continued good health and sharp mind represented an obstacle to their plans. The revelation hit me like a physical blow when I overheard a phone conversation between Thomas and Linda while they thought I was napping in my study. They were discussing their concern that I might live for many more years and potentially spend down the family assets on what Thomas called questionable decisions. Linda worried that my interest in charitable giving might lead me to donate money that rightfully belonged to them and their children. They talked about the need to get legal advice about having me declared incompetent before I could make any major financial decisions they disagreed with. Listening to my own children discuss me as if I were already dead or mentally absent was one of the most painful experiences of my life. These were the people I had loved unconditionally, supported financially and emotionally through every challenge and triumph, and raised to be good, caring human beings. Yet here they were, plotting to take away my autonomy and control over assets I had spent a lifetime accumulating, all because they believed they knew better than I did how my money should be managed. That conversation changed everything for me. I realized that my children's increasing concern about my mental state wasn't motivated by love or genuine worry about my well-being. It was driven by greed and impatience, by their desire to control resources they felt entitled to inherit. They had decided I was no longer competent, not because of any real evidence of decline, but because my continued independence threatened their financial expectations. The irony was almost laughable. Here I was, still successfully running a complex business, managing multiple investment portfolios, and making sound financial decisions that continued to grow our family wealth. Yet, my children were so focused on getting their hands on that wealth that they couldn't see past their own assumptions about aging and mental decline. They had convinced themselves that any 73-year-old woman must be losing her faculties, regardless of evidence to the contrary. Dr. Caroline Foster, my longtime physician, confirmed what I already knew when I asked her for a comprehensive cognitive assessment. At 73, I showed no signs of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other condition that would affect my decision-making capacity. My memory was within normal ranges for my age, my reasoning abilities remained sharp, and my judgment was sound. Dr. Foster was actually impressed by my mental acuity and told me that many of her patients half my age showed more cognitive decline than I did. Armed with this professional confirmation of my mental competence, I began planning my response to my children's campaign against me. If they wanted to treat me like a senile old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own money, I would show them exactly what this supposedly addled mind was capable of accomplishing. If they believed they were entitled to inherit wealth they had never truly earned, I would demonstrate that entitlement doesn't guarantee anything. The first step was getting a complete picture of exactly what my children had been saying about me and to whom. I asked James Mitchell, my attorney for the past 15 years, to conduct discreet inquiries about whether any of my family members had approached other lawyers about guardianship or conservatorship proceedings. What he discovered was both illuminating and infuriating. Thomas had indeed consulted with an elder law attorney about the process for having someone declared mentally incompetent, and Linda had been asking friends for recommendations for geriatric psychiatrists who might be willing to evaluate my mental state. James was professionally outraged by these revelations. He had worked with me on countless complex legal matters over the years and had never observed any decline in my mental capabilities. In fact, he noted that my recent work on restructuring the family trusts had shown sophisticated understanding of tax law and estate planning that would challenge most people half my age. He assured me that any attempt to have me declared incompetent would fail spectacularly given my obvious mental acuity and the lack of any supporting medical evidence. But more importantly, James confirmed that my children had no legal standing to challenge my decisions about my own money as long as I remained mentally competent. The assets in question were mine to dispose of as I saw fit, and neither the company nor the trust funds were subject to any claims from beneficiaries who had not yet inherited them. This knowledge gave me the confidence to move forward with a plan that would address their behavior in a way they would never forget. Robert Chen, my financial advisor, was the next person I brought into my confidence. Robert had been managing my investment portfolio for 8 years and had watched it grow substantially under his guidance and my oversight. Like James, he was shocked to learn that my children were questioning my mental competence, as our recent meetings had involved sophisticated discussions about market trends, risk management, and long-term financial planning strategies. Robert helped me understand exactly how much financial power I wielded and what options were available to me. The trust funds, while established for my children's benefit, could be modified or even dissolved under certain circumstances outlined in the original documents. The company's stock was entirely mine to control as I saw fit. My personal assets, including the house, investment accounts, and various other holdings, were substantial enough to ensure my comfortable retirement, regardless of what I decided to do with the family wealth. Most importantly, Robert confirmed that I had every legal right to redirect my assets toward charitable purposes if I chose to do so. He had actually been encouraging me for years to consider more substantial charitable giving as a way to reduce estate taxes and create a meaningful legacy beyond simply enriching my children. The idea of using my wealth to benefit causes I cared about, rather than funding the entitled attitudes of ungrateful children, began to seem not just reasonable but morally imperative. Grace Williams, director of the Portland Children's Hospital Foundation, became an unexpected ally in my planning process. I had been supporting the hospital's work for years through modest annual donations, but I had never considered the possibility of making a transformational gift that could create lasting change. When I reached out to Grace to discuss expanded charitable giving, she was thrilled to learn about my interest in making a more significant impact. Grace showed me exactly how foundation gifts worked and what kind of difference major donations could make in the lives of sick children and their families. The hospital had been trying to raise funds for a new pediatric cancer treatment center, and my potential contribution could make that dream a reality. She helped me understand the tax benefits of charitable giving and introduced me to other major donors who had found great satisfaction in using their wealth to create positive change in their communities. What struck me most about my conversations with Grace was how she treated me with the respect and deference that my own children had stopped showing me. She valued my opinions, sought my input on how the donation might be structured, and clearly saw me as a competent, intelligent woman, capable of making important decisions about substantial sums of money. The contrast with my children's patronizing attitude was stark and painful. As Thanksgiving approached, I realized it would provide the perfect opportunity to address my family's behavior in a dramatic and memorable way. The holiday had always been special in our family, with everyone gathering at my house for an elaborate dinner that Linda typically spent weeks planning. This year's celebration would include all my children and their spouses, plus my 2 grandchildren who were home from college. It would be the largest family gathering we'd had in months, which meant it would provide the biggest audience for what I had planned. The guest list for this year's Thanksgiving dinner read like a roster of people who had been discussing my supposed mental decline behind my back. Thomas and Ashley would be there with their son Brandon, home from his junior year at University of Oregon. Linda and Patrick were coming with their daughter Sophia, who was in her sophomore year at Portland State. Daniel would attend alone, as usual, probably arriving late and leaving early to avoid too much family interaction. What none of them knew was that I had also invited some additional guests who would witness whatever unfolded. James Mitchell would be joining us, ostensibly as a family friend, but actually as my legal counsel should I need professional support. Helen would be present not just as my housekeeper but as someone who had observed my daily life and could attest to my mental competence. I had even arranged for Dr. Foster to stop by during dinner, supposedly for a social visit, but actually to provide medical testimony about my cognitive state if necessary. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here I was, at 73 years old, having to prove to my own children that I was still capable of making decisions about my own money and my own life. The very people who owed their comfortable existences to my decades of hard work and financial success were now trying to take away my autonomy because they thought they knew better than I did how my assets should be managed. But they had made one crucial mistake in their campaign against me. They had underestimated exactly how sharp my mind remained and how much fight I still had left in me. They assumed that because I was getting older, I must be getting weaker and more malleable. They thought that their combined pressure and concern would eventually wear me down and convince me to step aside gracefully. What they didn't realize was that 40 years of building a business from nothing and navigating the male-dominated construction industry had taught me how to fight battles they couldn't even imagine. I had faced down aggressive competitors, hostile clients, and skeptical bankers who thought a woman had no business running a construction company. My own entitled children would prove to be a much easier challenge than some of the obstacles I had already overcome. As I made my final preparations for Thanksgiving dinner, I felt a mixture of sadness and anticipation that I had never experienced before. Sadness because I was about to confront the people I loved most in the world about their betrayal of my trust and their disrespect for my autonomy. Anticipation because I was finally going to show them that this supposedly senile old woman still had some surprises left in her. The stage was set for a Thanksgiving dinner that none of us would ever forget. My children thought they were coming to evaluate my mental state and perhaps push me closer to accepting their version of what my future should look like. Instead, they were about to discover that their inheritance plans had just taken a very different direction than they had ever imagined possible. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving became a masterclass in family manipulation that I watched unfold with growing clarity and disgust. What had once seemed like loving concern now revealed itself as a coordinated campaign designed to undermine my confidence and establish their narrative of my declining mental state. Each interaction felt calculated, each expression of worry, carefully crafted to support their ultimate goal of gaining control over my assets. Thomas began stopping by the house almost daily, always with some excuse about checking on company business or bringing Ashley by to visit. But I noticed how his eyes would scan my living spaces, taking inventory of anything that might suggest I wasn't maintaining my home properly. He would ask me the same questions repeatedly, then act concerned when I pointed out that he had already asked me those things. When I showed him quarterly reports that demonstrated our continued strong performance, he would nod politely, but then change the subject to ask if I was remembering to take my medications or eating properly. The most infuriating part was how he had started speaking to Helen as if she were my keeper rather than my employee. Thomas would pull her aside during his visits and ask leading questions about my daily routine, whether I seemed confused about anything, if I had been forgetting appointments or important tasks. Helen later told me that he had even suggested she should call him immediately if she noticed any concerning behavior from me, as if I were a child who needed constant supervision. Ashley, his wife, had always been sweet and deferential during family gatherings, but now I saw a calculating side to her that I had never noticed before. She began bringing me gifts that seemed designed to highlight my supposed limitations, like a large button telephone because the regular one might be too complicated for me to use, or a pill organizer because keeping track of medications could be challenging for someone my age. Each gift came with a gentle explanation about how it would make my life easier, delivered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Linda's approach was more subtle but equally patronizing. She started arriving with prepared meals, claiming she was worried I wasn't eating well enough. She would rearrange my kitchen cabinets while she was there, explaining that she was just trying to make things more accessible for me. When I protested that I preferred my kitchen organized the way I had it, she would exchange meaningful glances with whoever else was present, as if my resistance to her help was further evidence of my declining judgment. The charitable boards that Linda served on became another avenue for her campaign against me. She began making comments to mutual acquaintances about how difficult it was to watch a parent age and lose their sharpness. She expressed concern about whether I was still capable of making sound financial decisions, particularly regarding charitable giving, which she suggested I might be doing impulsively without proper consideration. These comments inevitably made their way back to me through Portland's well-connected social network, adding another layer of humiliation to an already painful situation. Patrick, Linda's husband, had always been relatively neutral in family matters, focusing on his dental practice and staying out of our business discussions. But now he began offering unsolicited medical opinions about aging and cognitive decline whenever we were together. He would mention patients he had seen who seemed fine on the surface but were actually struggling with early-stage dementia. He suggested that I should consider seeing a geriatric specialist for a comprehensive evaluation, just to establish a baseline for my mental health as I continued aging. Daniel's contribution to their campaign was perhaps the most hurtful because it felt like such a betrayal of our previously close relationship. As the youngest and most creative of my children, he had always been the one who seemed to understand me best. We had bonded over our shared appreciation for art and culture, and I had supported his unconventional career choices when his siblings thought he was wasting his potential. But now he was using that intimacy against me, expressing concern about what he called my increasing rigidity and resistance to change. He pointed to my business expansion plans as evidence that I was taking unnecessary risks with the family's financial security. He suggested that my interest in sustainable building practices might be the result of being influenced by environmental activists who were taking advantage of my supposed vulnerability. When I showed him articles about the growing market for green construction, he dismissed them as propaganda designed to confuse older investors who didn't understand modern business trends. The grandchildren were being used as weapons in this campaign as well, though I suspected they didn't fully understand what was happening. Brandon, Thomas's 22-year-old son, had always been respectful and affectionate with me, but now his visits felt scripted. He would ask me questions about family history, then act concerned when my recollections differed even slightly from the versions he had apparently been told by his parents. When I shared stories about building the business with his grandfather, he would listen politely, but then ask if I was sure I was remembering everything correctly. Sophia, Linda's 19-year-old daughter, took a different approach that was somehow even more painful. She began treating me with exaggerated patience and kindness, speaking to me in the overly cheerful tone people use with small children or the mentally impaired. She would compliment me on simple tasks like remembering her college major or recognizing a mutual acquaintance, as if these basic mental functions were remarkable achievements for someone my age. Her apparent sweetness made it difficult to object to her behavior without seeming unreasonable, which I suspected was exactly the point. The most devastating part of watching this coordinated campaign unfold was realizing how long it had probably been going on without my awareness. Looking back, with clearer eyes, I could see that the signs had been there for months, maybe even years. The gradual shift in how they spoke to me, the increasing frequency of their concerned comments about my age, the way they had begun making decisions about family matters without consulting me first. What I had interpreted as natural evolution in our relationships was actually a deliberate strategy to marginalize me and establish their narrative of my incompetence. Helen became my primary source of intelligence about what was happening when I wasn't present. She overheard phone conversations between my children where they discussed their growing confidence that I was becoming mentally unstable. They compared notes on my supposed lapses in memory and judgment, building a case they could present to medical professionals or legal authorities if necessary. Thomas had apparently been keeping a journal of incidents he considered evidence of my declining mental state, including such damning examples as my forgetting the name of a restaurant we had visited once 3 years ago. The irony of their concerns about my mental state became clear when I compared their behavior to my actual performance in managing complex business and financial matters. While they were documenting my failure to remember minor social details, I was successfully negotiating multi-million-dollar construction contracts that required sophisticated understanding of legal language, market conditions, and risk assessment. While they worried about my ability to manage my household, I was making investment decisions that continued to grow our family wealth at rates that impressed even seasoned financial professionals. Robert Chen, my financial advisor, became increasingly helpful in providing perspective on what was really happening. During our monthly meetings, he would share observations about how other wealthy families he worked with dealt with generational transitions. He had seen similar situations where adult children became impatient about inheritances and began pressuring aging parents to step aside before they were ready. In some cases, he told me, the pressure came from financial stress in the younger generation, but more often it simply reflected entitlement and lack of appreciation for the work required to build and maintain wealth. Robert helped me understand that my children's behavior was not unusual among families with significant assets. The difference was that some elderly parents gave in to the pressure, either because they genuinely were experiencing cognitive decline or because they wanted to avoid family conflict. Others, like me, recognized what was happening and chose to fight back. He assured me that my financial decision-making remained sharp and that there was no objective reason for me to surrender control of my assets to people who had never demonstrated the wisdom or work ethic required to manage them successfully. James Mitchell, my attorney, provided similar reassurance from a legal perspective. He had dealt with numerous cases where adult children attempted to gain control of their parents' assets through guardianship or conservatorship proceedings, and he was confident that any such attempt in my case would fail. The evidence required to prove mental incompetence was substantial and specific, and my continued success in business and financial management made it impossible to argue that I lacked the capacity to make decisions about my own money. More importantly, James helped me understand the full range of options available to me in response to my children's behavior. The trust funds I had established for each of them included provisions that allowed me to modify or revoke them under certain circumstances, including situations where beneficiaries engaged in behavior that I deemed harmful to family harmony, or contrary to the values Frank and I had tried to instill in them. Their campaign to have me declared incompetent could easily be construed as exactly the kind of harmful behavior that would justify such action. The company structure also gave me complete control over succession planning. While my children had always assumed that Thomas would eventually take over as CEO, there was nothing in our corporate documents that guaranteed such an outcome. I had intentionally maintained flexibility in our ownership and management structure specifically to avoid the kind of family conflicts that could destroy a business. If my children couldn't demonstrate respect for my continued leadership, I had no obligation to hand the company over to them regardless of their expectations. Dr. Foster's comprehensive cognitive assessment provided the medical documentation I needed to refute any claims about my mental competence. The testing she administered was extensive and covered memory, reasoning, problem-solving, and judgment in ways that went far beyond the casual observations my children were using to build their case against me. The results showed that my cognitive function was not just normal for my age, but actually above average in several key areas that related directly to the kind of complex decision-making required for managing business and financial matters. Dr. Foster was particularly impressed by my performance on tests that measured what she called executive function, the mental processes involved in planning, organizing, and making decisions. These were exactly the capabilities my children were claiming I had lost, yet the objective evidence showed I retained them at levels that would be considered excellent for someone decades younger. She provided me with detailed written documentation of my mental competence that would be valuable if legal challenges arose, but more importantly, it gave me confidence that my own assessment of my capabilities was accurate. The psychological impact of having my mental competence professionally validated cannot be overstated. For months, I had been subjected to constant suggestions that I was losing my sharpness, forgetting important things, and making poor decisions. Even though I knew these claims were exaggerated or false, the relentless repetition had begun to make me doubt myself. Having an objective medical professional confirm that my mind remained sharp and capable was like emerging from a fog of gaslighting into clear sunlight. Armed with this documentation and professional support, I began making concrete plans for how to address my children's behavior at Thanksgiving dinner. The holiday gathering would provide the perfect opportunity to confront them publicly about their campaign against me while simultaneously demonstrating that my mental faculties remained completely intact. More importantly, it would allow me to announce my decision about the trust funds in a way that would make clear the connection between their behavior and the consequences they would face. Grace Williams from the Children's Hospital Foundation had been working with me to structure a charitable gift that would have maximum impact while providing substantial tax benefits. The amount I was considering donating was significant enough to transform the hospital's ability to serve sick children, but it also represented money that my children had been counting on inheriting. Grace was thrilled by my generosity and impressed by my sophisticated understanding of how charitable giving could be structured to achieve multiple goals simultaneously. The legal and financial mechanics of redirecting my assets toward charitable purposes were more complex than I had initially realized, but they were entirely feasible with proper planning. James worked with Robert to ensure that my charitable commitments could be structured in ways that would be irrevocable once implemented, preventing any future attempts by my children to challenge or reverse my decisions. We developed a timeline that would allow me to make the announcement at Thanksgiving while ensuring that the actual transfers would be completed quickly enough to prevent any legal interference. Helen played a crucial role in preparing for the Thanksgiving confrontation by helping me gather evidence of my children's behavior and statements. She had been keeping notes about their conversations and actions during their visits, documenting the pattern of disrespect and manipulation that had been escalating for months. Her observations would be valuable in explaining to other family members and friends why I had chosen to respond so dramatically to what might otherwise appear to be normal family concern about an aging parent. The guest list for Thanksgiving. Dinner became a strategic consideration as I planned how to make my announcement most effectively. In addition to my immediate family, I decided to invite several people who could serve as witnesses to both my mental competence and my children's behavior. James would be there as my attorney. Dr. Foster would make an appearance to provide medical perspective if needed, and Grace would attend to discuss the charitable work that would benefit from my gifts. Their presence would ensure that my children couldn't later claim that I had been confused or manipulated when I made my announcement. I also decided to invite Frank Torres, my late husband's business partner and longtime friend, who had remained close to our family after Frank's death. Frank Torres had known my children their entire lives and had observed the changes in their attitudes toward me over the past year. His presence would provide additional perspective on my mental state, while also serving as a reminder of the values and work ethic that had built our family's wealth in the first place. The menu planning for Thanksgiving dinner took on symbolic significance as I considered how to orchestrate the entire event. Linda had always taken pride in organizing our holiday meals, but this year I decided to take control of the arrangements, myself. I wanted every detail to reflect my continued competence and autonomy, from the complexity of the meal preparation to the elegance of the table setting. Helen and I spent hours planning a dinner that would showcase my ability to manage sophisticated logistics, while creating an atmosphere appropriate for the dramatic announcement I had planned. The timing of my announcement also required careful consideration. I wanted to wait until everyone was present and settled, but not so late in the evening that people might attribute my statements to fatigue or the effects of wine. I decided to make my speech after the main course but before dessert, when everyone would be relaxed and attentive, but still sharp enough to fully comprehend what I was telling them. The placement of my guests around the table would also be strategic, ensuring that my children would be unable to avoid eye contact or slip away during my remarks. As the date approached, I found myself experiencing a mixture of anticipation and sadness that surprised me with its intensity. Anticipation because I was finally going to address their disrespectful behavior and demonstrate that their assumptions about my mental decline were completely unfounded. Sadness because I was essentially declaring war on my own children, people I had loved and supported unconditionally for decades. The fact that their greed and entitlement had driven me to such drastic measures felt like a failure of parenting that I would have to live with for whatever years remained to me. But as I reflected on everything that had happened over the past year, I realized that my response was not just justified, but necessary. My children had chosen to treat me as an inconvenient obstacle to their financial goals, rather than as a person deserving of respect and autonomy. They had conspired behind my back to undermine my confidence and establish legal grounds for taking control of my assets. They had shown themselves to be ungrateful, manipulative, and willing to sacrifice our family relationships for money they had never earned. The irony of their situation would become clear on Thanksgiving Day. In their effort to gain control of wealth they felt entitled to inherit, they had demonstrated exactly why they didn't deserve to inherit it. Their behavior had revealed character flaws that Frank and I had tried to prevent through our emphasis on hard work, humility, and respect for others. By showing me that they valued money more than family relationships, they had made my decision about the trust funds much easier than it might otherwise have been. The final weeks before Thanksgiving passed quickly as I completed my preparations for what would undoubtedly be the most dramatic family gathering in our history. Every phone call from my children, every visit to check on my well-being, every expression of concern about my mental state only strengthened my resolve to follow through with my plan. They had created this situation through their own choices, and they would have to live with the consequences of underestimating the woman who had built everything they hoped to inherit. Thanksgiving morning arrived with the kind of crisp November weather that made Portland feel like a Norman Rockwell painting. all golden light filtering through bare maple trees and the promise of family warmth inside cozy homes. I had been awake since 5 in the morning, not from anxiety, but from the electric energy of someone who knows they're about to change everything. Helen arrived early to help with final preparations, and I could see in her eyes the same mixture of anticipation and concern that I felt coursing through my own veins. The dining room looked magnificent, set with my grandmother's china and the crystal glasses Frank and I had received as wedding gifts 50 years ago. Every detail had been planned to perfection, from the arrangement of autumn flowers Helen had gathered from my garden to the precise placement of chairs that would ensure optimal sightlines for what I had planned. The table could easily accommodate 12 people, and today it would hold exactly that number, though several of my guests had no idea they were about to witness the most dramatic family confrontation in Caldwell history. Thomas and Ashley arrived promptly at noon, bringing Brandon home from college for what they undoubtedly expected to be a routine family holiday. I watched from my kitchen window as Thomas surveyed the exterior of my house with his usual critical eye, probably looking for signs of neglect that would support his narrative about my declining ability to maintain my home. Ashley carried a covered dish that I knew would be her famous sweet potato casserole, a family tradition that she took pride in contributing to our holiday meals. Brandon looked healthy and happy, taller than when I had seen him last summer and carrying himself with the confident ease of a young man who had never worried about money or wondered where his next opportunity would come from. The irony of his situation would become apparent soon enough, though I felt a pang of sadness knowing that my announcement would fundamentally alter his understanding of his future financial security. Still, at 22, he had plenty of time to build his own success if he inherited even a fraction of his grandfather's work ethic. Linda and Patrick arrived 15 minutes later with Sophia, who bounded up my front steps with the energy of a teenager home from college for her first real break of the semester. She hugged me with genuine affection, and I found myself wondering how much of her parents' campaign against me she had absorbed versus how much was simply the natural self-absorption of a 19-year-old focused on her own life and social circle. Patrick carried himself with his usual reserved professionalism, though I noticed he was observing me more carefully than usual, probably looking for signs of the mental decline his wife had been describing to him. Daniel showed up 20 minutes late as predicted, arriving in his paint-splattered pickup truck and wearing what he probably considered his best casual clothes for a family dinner. His artistic sensibilities had always made him somewhat critical of what he saw as the bourgeois formality of our holiday gatherings, but he made an effort to participate because he knew it mattered to me. Today, however, I suspected his presence was motivated more by curiosity about my mental state than by familial affection, which saddened me more than I wanted to admit. The early part of the afternoon unfolded with the careful choreography of a family that had been gathering for holidays together for decades. Everyone knew their roles, from Ashley helping Linda coordinate the side dishes to Patrick carving the turkey with the methodical precision he brought to his dental practice. Brandon and Sophia caught up on college experiences, while Daniel examined my latest art acquisitions with the kind of professional attention he usually reserved for gallery visits. But underneath the familiar rhythms of our holiday tradition, I could feel the tension of unspoken agendas and hidden conversations. Thomas spent considerable time asking me detailed questions about my daily routine, supposedly out of concern for my well-being, but actually gathering evidence for his mental competence file. Linda made several comments about how wonderful it was that I was still able to manage such an elaborate dinner, as if cooking a turkey represented some kind of remarkable cognitive achievement for someone my age. The most telling moment came when I momentarily forgot where I had put the serving spoon for the cranberry sauce. It was a minor domestic oversight that any host might experience during the complexity of serving a large holiday meal, but I watched my children exchange meaningful glances as if I had just provided definitive proof of mental decline. Ashley quickly found the spoon in the drawer where it belonged, commenting with exaggerated cheerfulness about how easy it was to misplace things when you were managing so many details at once. James Mitchell arrived at 2:30, carrying a bottle of excellent wine and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from 40 years of practicing law in Portland's elite circles. My children greeted him warmly, as they always had, but I could see curiosity in their eyes about why I had invited him to a family dinner. Thomas, in particular, seemed slightly uncomfortable with James's presence, though he covered it well with polite conversation about business and politics. Dr. Foster made her appearance an hour later, timing her visit perfectly to coincide with the lull between dinner preparation and actual serving. She brought flowers from her own garden and explained to everyone that she had been in the neighborhood visiting another patient and thought she would stop by to wish me a happy Thanksgiving. Her easy conversation with my family about medical topics helped establish her credibility while giving her an opportunity to observe my interactions with my children in a natural setting. Grace Williams was the final addition to our gathering, arriving with homemade dinner rolls and enthusiasm about the Foundation's upcoming projects. I introduced her to my family as a friend from my charitable work, which was technically true, even though her primary purpose was to witness my announcement about the major gift I planned to make to the Children's Hospital. Her presence added another layer of respectability to the gathering while ensuring that someone outside the family would be able to attest to my mental clarity during the evening's events. Frank Torres completed our group, bringing with him 4 decades of shared history with our family and the kind of unshakable loyalty that comes from building a business together through good times and bad. His weather-beaten hands and gentle manner reminded everyone of the working-class roots that had built our family's wealth, and his obvious affection for me provided a stark contrast to the subtle condescension I had been experiencing from my own children. As we gathered around the dining room table, I felt a moment of genuine gratitude for the abundance that surrounded us. The food was magnificent, the company was stimulating, and the setting was everything that Frank and I had dreamed of when we first imagined the family life we wanted to build together. But I also felt the weight of what I was about to do, the knowledge that this gathering would mark the end of one chapter in our family's story and the beginning of another that would be fundamentally different. The conversation during dinner was lively and wide-ranging, covering everything from Brandon's economics classes to Sophia's adventures in Portland State's theater program. Daniel shared news about a recent gallery showing that had featured several of his metal sculptures, while Patrick discussed advances in dental technology that were revolutionizing his practice. On the surface, we looked like any successful family enjoying a holiday together, but I could feel the undercurrents of tension and agenda that would soon explode into the open. Thomas dominated much of the conversation with updates about Caldwell, construction's recent projects, positioning himself as the de facto spokesperson for the company's activities. I noticed how he spoke about our business decisions using language that subtly minimized my role, referring to choices we had made without acknowledging that I remained the sole owner and ultimate decision-maker. His assumption of authority was so smooth in practice that I realized he had probably been doing it for months without my full awareness. Linda contributed her own subtle undermining by discussing the various charitable boards she served on and making veiled suggestions about the importance of getting professional advice before making major philanthropic commitments. She mentioned several elderly board members who had made generous but poorly planned gifts that had created tax problems for their families, delivering her warnings with the kind of concerned smile that made them impossible to challenge directly. The most painful part of watching their performance was seeing how natural it had become for them to treat me as a peripheral figure in conversations about my own life and assets. They had convinced themselves so thoroughly that I was declining mentally that they no longer felt the need to include me meaningfully in discussions about the family business, charitable giving, or financial planning. They talked around me and over me as if I were already the confused elderly woman they wanted everyone to believe I had become. James and Dr. Foster, however, engaged me in substantive conversations that highlighted my continued mental sharpness in ways that created obvious contrast with my children's behavior. James asked for my analysis of recent changes in construction industry regulations, leading to a detailed discussion that demonstrated my sophisticated understanding of complex legal and business issues. Dr. Foster sought my opinion on healthcare policy matters, resulting in an exchange that showcased my ability to think critically about multifaceted social and economic problems. Grace Williams proved to be particularly valuable in this regard, discussing foundation governance and philanthropic strategy in ways that required me to demonstrate extensive knowledge about nonprofit management, tax law, and community needs assessment. Our conversation was animated and intellectually stimulating, clearly showing anyone who was paying attention that my cognitive abilities remained sharp and my judgment sound. The contrast between how these professionals treated me and how my own children treated me became increasingly obvious as the afternoon progressed. Where James, Dr. Foster, and Grace sought my opinions and valued my insights, Thomas, Linda, and Daniel spoke to me with the kind of careful patience usually reserved for individuals with significant cognitive impairment. The difference was so stark that even the grandchildren began to notice, though they seemed more confused than concerned by the dynamic. As we finished the main course and Helen began clearing plates, I realized the moment had arrived for me to address the elephant in the room. The conversation had reached a natural lull. Everyone was present and attentive, and the witnesses I had carefully assembled were positioned to observe everything that was about to unfold. I stood up slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to command the kind of attention that comes with deliberate ceremonial movement. "Before Helen brings out dessert," I announced, my voice carrying the authoritative tone I had perfected during 40 years of running business meetings, "I have some important news to share with all of you. Some wonderful news, actually, about decisions I've made regarding my charitable giving and the family trust funds." The reaction was immediate and telling. Thomas's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, his eyes sharpening with the kind of alert attention he usually reserved for potential business threats. Linda's practiced social smile faltered as she processed the connection between charitable giving and trust funds, clearly sensing that her inheritance expectations might be about to take an unexpected turn. Daniel sat up straighter in his chair, his usual artistic detachment replaced by sudden focus on financial matters that directly affected his future. Ashley and Patrick exchanged worried glances, obviously understanding that major changes in family financial arrangements could have significant implications for their own household's economic security. The grandchildren looked confused but interested, sensing adult drama without fully comprehending its significance. Helen paused in her clearing activities, positioning herself to witness whatever was about to unfold. "As most of you know," I continued, settling back into my chair with the kind of calm confidence that comes from being completely prepared for battle, "I've been involved with the Portland Children's Hospital Foundation for several years now. Grace here has been educating me about the tremendous impact that major gifts can have on the hospital's ability to serve sick children and their families." Grace nodded encouragingly, though I could see in her eyes that she was beginning to understand she was about to witness something far more dramatic than a routine announcement about charitable giving. James leaned back in his chair with the slight smile of someone who had seen enough family confrontations to recognize the setup for a major revelation. "What you may not know," I went on, enjoying the way my children were hanging on every word despite their assumptions about my declining mental faculties, "is that I've been having some very interesting conversations over the past few months. Conversations about my mental competence, my ability to make sound financial decisions, and whether I should still be trusted to manage my own affairs." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as my children realized that their carefully orchestrated campaign had not gone unnoticed. Thomas opened his mouth as if to speak, but I held up my hand in a gesture that brooked no interruption. "I've heard suggestions that I might be developing dementia, that my judgment is becoming unreliable, that perhaps I should step back from business decisions and let younger, sharper minds take control of the family assets. These suggestions have come not from medical professionals or objective observers, but from my own children, who apparently believe that reaching the age of 73 automatically disqualifies me from managing money I spent 40 years earning." Linda's face had gone pale, while Daniel squirmed uncomfortably in his seat like a teenager caught in a lie. Thomas, to his credit, maintained better composure, though I could see the calculation behind his eyes as he tried to figure out how to minimize the damage from what was clearly about to become a public confrontation. So I decided to get some professional opinions about my mental state, I continued, gesturing toward Dr. Foster. Caroline here administered comprehensive cognitive testing last month, and I'm delighted to report that my mental faculties are not just intact, but actually above average for my age group. James has been helping me review my legal rights and options, and Robert Chen has confirmed that my investment decision-making remains as sharp as ever. Dr. Foster nodded professionally, while James maintained his lawyer's poker face, despite what I suspected was considerable amusement at the unfolding drama. My children looked like they had been caught shoplifting, their carefully constructed narrative crumbling in real time. But here's what really opened my eyes, I said, my voice taking on the steel edge that had served me well in countless business negotiations. The people questioning my competence aren't concerned about my well-being. They're concerned about their inheritances. They've been building a case for having me declared mentally incompetent, not because they love me, but because they want control of money they haven't earned and don't deserve. Thomas finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual confident baritone. Mother, that's not fair. We're worried about you. We've seen signs that you're not thinking as clearly as you used to. Have you really? I asked with mock curiosity. Because while you've been documenting my supposed mental lapses, I've been successfully negotiating the largest contracts in our company's history. While you've been questioning my judgment, I've been making investment decisions that have grown our family wealth by millions of dollars. While you've been treating me like a confused old woman, I've been running circles around competitors half my age. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the grandchildren seemed to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented and potentially life-changing. Helen had stopped pretending to clear dishes and was openly watching the confrontation unfold with the fascination of someone who had front-row seats to a dramatic performance. So, I've made some decisions, I announced, savoring the moment of maximum dramatic impact. Decisions about how to respond to children who value my money more than my dignity, who see my continued good health as an obstacle to their financial plans, who conspire behind my back to take away my autonomy and independence. Ashley was now gripping Patrick's hand so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Daniel looked like he might be sick. Thomas seemed to be calculating whether there was any way to salvage the situation, while Linda appeared to be in shock. The trust funds that you've all been counting on inheriting, I said with deliberate slowness, are going to be redirected. Not all of them, mind you. I'm not completely heartless. But the majority of those assets will be donated to charitable causes that can actually put the money to good use helping people who need it. The explosion of voices was immediate and chaotic. Thomas demanded to know if I had lost my mind. Linda burst into tears, and Daniel started protesting that this wasn't fair. Ashley and Patrick sat in stunned silence while the grandchildren looked around the table in confusion and alarm. But I wasn't finished yet. This was my moment, my opportunity, to address decades of accumulated resentment and disappointment in my children's character and values. I had spent too many years enabling their sense of entitlement, and it was time for them to understand the consequences of taking my love and support for granted. I raised my hand again, and the authority in that simple gesture was enough to quiet the eruption of protests and accusations that had exploded around my dining room table. The power dynamics that had been shifting subtly for months suddenly crystallized in that moment, with everyone present understanding that the woman they had underestimated was very much in control of the situation. Let me finish, I said with the kind of calm authority that comes from holding all the cards in a high-stakes game. Because there's more you need to understand about the position you've put yourselves in, and the consequences of treating family like an obstacle to your financial ambitions. Thomas was the first to try to regain control of the narrative, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. This is insane, Mother. You can't just give away our inheritance because you're angry about some imagined slight. We have families to think about, responsibilities, obligations that depend on that money. Your inheritance? I repeated, letting the words hang in the air like an accusation. Interesting choice of language, Thomas. Last I checked, inheritance referred to assets that someone actually owned, not money that belonged to someone else, who happened to still be alive and mentally competent. Ashley placed a restraining hand on her husband's arm, clearly recognizing that his aggressive approach was making the situation worse. But Thomas was too angry to be diplomatic, too shocked by the sudden reversal of his expectations to think strategically about how to respond. "You know what I mean," he said, his voice rising. "That money has always been earmarked for us and our children. You and Dad always talked about leaving us financially secure, about building something that would benefit future generations. You can't just change the rules now because you're upset." "Actually," James interjected quietly, "she can do exactly that. The trust documents include specific provisions that allow Mrs. Caldwell to modify or revoke the trusts under certain circumstances. One of those circumstances involves beneficiary behavior that she deems contrary to family values or harmful to family harmony." Linda looked up from her tears with desperate hope. "What kind of behavior? We haven't done anything." "Wrong. We love Mother, and we're concerned about her well-being. How is that contrary to family values?" Dr. Foster cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I can provide some medical perspective here. Mrs. Caldwell asked me to conduct comprehensive cognitive testing specifically because she was aware that questions had been raised about her mental competence. The results showed no evidence of cognitive decline, dementia, or any other condition that would impair her decision-making capacity." "But we've seen signs," Daniel protested, finally finding his voice. "Forgetting things, repeating herself, making questionable business decisions. Those are real concerns, not imagined problems." "Are they?" I asked, turning my full attention to my youngest son. "Let's examine these supposed signs of my declining mental state. Thomas has been keeping a journal, apparently, documenting my lapses. Would you like to share some examples with our guests?" Thomas looked trapped, clearly not expecting his surveillance activities to become public knowledge. "I wasn't keeping a journal to hurt you. I was documenting incidents because I was genuinely worried." "Such as?" I pressed, enjoying his discomfort. "Well, you forgot the name of that restaurant where we had lunch last month. And you asked me the same question about Brandon's major twice in one conversation. You've been making risky business decisions without consulting the family." Grace Williams, who had been quietly observing the family drama with the fascination of someone witnessing a sociology experiment, couldn't help but laugh. "Forgive me, but those examples hardly constitute evidence of mental incompetence. I'm 62 years old and I forget restaurant names regularly. And questioning someone twice about their grandchild's college major sounds more like normal grandparent interest than cognitive decline." Frank Torres nodded in agreement, his weathered face creased with what might have been amusement. "I've been watching Maggie run business meetings for 40 years, and she's as sharp now as she was when we were building this company from nothing. Sharper, maybe, because she's got 4 decades of experience to draw on." "The business decisions you're calling risky," I continued, looking directly at Thomas, "have generated more profit in the past year than any comparable period in our company's history. The Sustainable Building Initiative that you opposed has brought in $12 million in new contracts and positioned us as industry leaders in green construction." Linda wiped her eyes and tried a different approach, appealing to emotion rather than logic. "But Mother, even if you're not experiencing cognitive decline now, what about the future? Shouldn't you want to ensure that your children and grandchildren are taken care of? What would Daddy think about you giving away money he worked so hard to earn?" The invocation of Frank's memory was a calculated move designed to manipulate my emotions. but it had the opposite effect from what Linda intended. Instead of making me feel guilty about my charitable plans, it reminded me of the values Frank and I had shared and the kind of people we had tried to raise our children to become. Your father, I said with quiet intensity, would be appalled by your behavior over the past year. Frank worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, to build something meaningful. He taught you that money was a tool for creating opportunities, not an entitlement that exempted you from effort or character development. I gestured around the elegant dining room, at the crystal and china and carefully prepared meal that represented decades of prosperity. Everything you see here, everything you've enjoyed your entire lives, came from work and sacrifice and treating people with dignity and respect. Frank would be disgusted to know that his children grew up to see his widow as an obstacle to their comfort, rather than as a person deserving of love and consideration. Patrick, who had remained silent throughout most of the confrontation, finally spoke up with the careful precision he brought to professional discussions. Mrs. Caldwell, I think we're all emotional right now and maybe saying things we don't mean. Perhaps we should take some time to cool down and discuss this more rationally when everyone has had a chance to process what's happening. Oh, I've been processing this for months, I replied. I've been watching my own children build a case for having me declared mentally incompetent. I've been listening to them discuss my supposed decline behind my back while they counted money I haven't even died yet. I've been enduring their patronizing concern while they positioned themselves to take control of assets they never earned. Helen, who had been standing quietly by the kitchen door, stepped forward with the kind of courage that comes from years of witnessing family dynamics from a unique perspective. If I may say something, Mrs. Caldwell has been managing this household, conducting business meetings, and handling complex financial matters every single day for the past year. I've never seen any sign of confusion or poor judgment. What I have seen is her children treating her with less respect than they would show a stranger. Brandon and Sophia had been following the adult conversation with growing understanding of its implications for their own futures. Brandon, who had always been the more outspoken of the two grandchildren, finally found his voice. Grandma, I don't understand what's happening here. Are you really giving away our college money and our inheritance because you're mad at Mom and Dad? The question cut through the adult posturing and got to the heart of what was really at stake. I looked at my grandson, seeing Frank's eyes and my own stubborn chin in his young face, and felt a moment of genuine sadness for the disruption I was about to cause in his carefully planned life. Brandon, I'm not giving away your college money. Your education will be provided for, just as it always has been. But I am redirecting money that your parents and aunt and uncle have been counting on inheriting, because they've shown me that they value that money more than they value treating me with basic human dignity. Sophia, who had always been more intuitive about family dynamics than her cousin, asked the question that none of the adults had been brave enough to voice directly. Is this permanent? I mean, if everyone apologizes and starts treating you better, would you change your mind about the donations? It was an astute question that revealed more emotional intelligence than any of my adult children had demonstrated throughout this entire ordeal. I considered my answer carefully, because it would determine whether this confrontation represented the beginning of a family reconciliation or the end of relationships as we had known them. That's an excellent question, Sophia. The answer depends on whether your parents and uncle are capable of understanding why their behavior has been so hurtful and disappointing. This isn't about apologies or temporary changes in how they treat me. This is about fundamental respect for my autonomy and recognition that I remain a competent adult with the right to make decisions about my own life and assets. Thomas leaned forward across the table, his earlier anger replaced by something that looked like desperation. Mother, please, I know we've made mistakes. Maybe we have been too focused on the inheritance, too worried about your age. But you have to understand, we're trying to protect you. We're trying to make sure you don't make decisions you'll regret later. Protect me from what exactly? I asked. From donating money to sick children, from supporting educational programs that create opportunities for disadvantaged young people, from using wealth in ways that might actually make a positive difference in the world. Linda tried once more to appeal to my maternal instincts. But what about us? What about your grandchildren's future security? Don't we matter to you anymore? Of course you matter to me, I said, and for the first time since beginning this confrontation, my voice softened slightly. You're my children, and I will always love you regardless of how you've disappointed me. But love doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior or allowing you to treat me as an inconvenience. Grace Williams, who had been observing this family drama with professional interest, chose this moment to provide some perspective on the charitable work that would benefit from my donations. If I may interject, the gift Mrs. Caldwell is considering would fund a new pediatric cancer treatment center that could save hundreds of children's lives. It would also establish scholarship programs for students who wouldn't otherwise have access to higher education. These aren't frivolous expenditures or emotional reactions to family conflict. They're investments in human potential that will create lasting positive impact. That's wonderful, Ashley said, with barely controlled sarcasm. But what about the impact on our family? What about the security and opportunities we've been planning for our own children? Your children will have every opportunity they've earned through their own efforts, I replied firmly. They'll have excellent educations, loving families, and the advantage of growing up in a household where work and achievement are valued. What they won't have is the assumption that significant wealth will simply be handed to them regardless of their character or contributions. Dr. Foster added her professional perspective to the discussion. From a psychological standpoint, inherited wealth can actually be detrimental to young people's development of work ethic and personal responsibility. Some of the most successful and fulfilled individuals I know are those who built their own achievements rather than relying on family money. Daniel, who had been uncharacteristically quiet for most of the confrontation, finally exploded with the frustration he had been containing. This is unbelievable. We're being punished for caring about you, for trying to look out for your best interests. You're destroying our family over some perceived slight that exists more in your imagination than in reality. Daniel, I said with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a slow learner, let me help you understand something. Caring about someone means respecting their autonomy and dignity. Looking out for someone's best interests means supporting their right to make their own decisions as long as they remain mentally competent. What you've been doing is neither caring nor looking out for my interests. You've been positioning yourselves to take control of my assets based on the assumption that I'm too old and confused to manage them properly. James Mitchell had been taking notes throughout the confrontation, and now he spoke up with the authority of someone who had witnessed similar family disputes countless times throughout his career. For the record, Mrs. Caldwell's charitable giving plans are entirely legal and carefully structured to maximize their impact while providing substantial tax benefits. The trust modifications are within her rights as the grantor, and her mental competence has been professionally verified. Any legal challenges to these decisions would be frivolous and expensive. The implications of James's statement hung heavy in the room. My children were not just losing their expected inheritance. They were being warned that any attempt to fight my decisions through the courts would likely fail and cost them additional money they could no longer count on having. Thomas made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his expectations. What would it take for you to reconsider? What do we need to do to prove that we respect you and value our relationship more than money? It was a reasonable question that deserved a thoughtful answer. But I had moved beyond the point where promises and apologies could repair the damage that had been done. Too much had been said and revealed for our relationships to simply return to their previous state. Thomas, the problem isn't what you need to do going forward. The problem is what you've already done. You've shown me that when push comes to shove, you see me as an impediment to your financial goals rather than as a person deserving of respect. You've conspired with your siblings to build a case for having me declared incompetent. You've treated me like a confused child who can't be trusted with her own money. I stood up from the table, feeling the weight of 73 years and the satisfaction of finally addressing behavior that had been eating away at my soul for months. Those actions revealed something about your character that can't be undone, with apologies or promises to do better in the future. They showed me who you really are when you think your financial interests are threatened. The silence that followed was complete and devastating. Even the grandchildren seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamics, something that couldn't be repaired with hugs and reassurances that everything would be fine. Helen stepped forward to begin clearing the dinner dishes, her movement breaking the spell that had held everyone frozen in their chairs. The practical necessity of ending the meal provided a graceful way for people to begin processing what had just happened and considering their responses to this new reality. But I wasn't quite finished. There was one more element of my plan that needed to be revealed, one final demonstration that the supposedly senile old woman they had been manipulating was more than capable of outmaneuvering them when necessary. "Before anyone leaves," I announced, reaching into the sideboard where I had carefully placed a manila folder earlier that morning. "There's one more thing you all need to understand about the situation you've created for yourselves." I pulled out a thick stack of documents and placed them deliberately on the table where everyone could see them. The papers were neatly organized and labeled, the product of weeks of careful preparation with James's legal guidance and Robert's financial expertise. These are the signed agreements for the charitable donations I mentioned. The paperwork was completed yesterday morning and filed with the appropriate authorities this afternoon. The transfers are irrevocable and will begin processing on Monday morning. The color drained from Thomas's face as he realized that this wasn't a threat or a negotiating tactic. The money he had been counting on was already gone, legally committed to causes that would never provide him with the comfortable retirement he had been planning. Linda grabbed for the papers with shaking hands, scanning the legal language as if she might find some loophole or escape clause that would restore her expectations of financial security. "This can't be legal. You can't just give away $15 million without consulting the beneficiaries. There have to be procedures, waiting periods, something." James leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of an attorney whose careful work was about to be validated. Actually, Mrs. Caldwell followed all proper procedures meticulously. The charitable commitments were structured as irrevocable, gifts with immediate tax benefits. The trust modifications were executed according to the original trust document's provisions for such changes. Everything is completely legal and properly documented. Daniel stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language, his artistic sensibilities apparently inadequate for processing the financial and legal reality of what had just happened to his future. "But this is crazy. You're talking about more money than most people see in their entire lives. You're just giving it away to spite us?" "I'm giving it away because it will do more good in the hands of people who need it than it would sitting in accounts waiting for you to inherit it," I corrected. "The spite, as you call it, is just a bonus that comes from watching entitled children learn that actions have consequences." Grace Williams could barely contain her excitement as she examined the donation agreements. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is extraordinary. The Pediatric Cancer Center will be able to serve children from across the Pacific Northwest. The scholarship programs will provide opportunities for hundreds of students over the coming decades. You're creating a legacy that will touch lives for generations." Ashley looked like she might faint as the full implications of the situation became clear to her. "What about Brandon's graduate school plans? What about the house renovations we've been planning? What about our retirement savings strategy? We've made financial commitments based on expectations about inheritance timelines." Then you've learned an expensive lesson about the difference between expectations and guarantees, I replied without sympathy. "Frank and I never promised you specific amounts of money or guaranteed inheritance schedules. We talked about wanting to leave you financially secure, But we never said that security would come without conditions, or regardless of how you treated us. Patrick, ever the practical professional, was already calculating the impact on his family's financial planning. This is going to require some major adjustments to our long-term strategies. We'll need to completely rethink our children's education funding and our own retirement timeline. Welcome to the real world, Frankie, Torres said with the blunt honesty of someone who had spent his life working for everything he achieved. Most people don't get to plan their financial futures around money that belongs to someone else. Most folks have to earn their security through their own efforts. Dr. Foster observed the family dynamics with professional interest, clearly fascinated by the psychological aspects of what was unfolding. It's remarkable how different family members are processing this information. Some are focused on practical adjustments, others are still in denial about the reality of the situation. Brandon and Sophia sat in stunned silence, beginning to understand that their comfortable assumptions about future financial support had just evaporated in a single afternoon. The trust funds they had never really thought about but had always known were there, providing a safety net for their adult lives, were gone. "Grandma," Sophia finally whispered, "what about college? I mean, I know you said our education would be provided for, but what does that actually mean now?" It was a fair question from a young person who was just beginning to understand how money worked and what this dramatic change might mean for her immediate future. I felt a stab of genuine sympathy for both grandchildren, who were innocent victims of their parents' greed and manipulation. "Your college educations will be fully funded through separate accounts I've established specifically for that purpose," I assured them. "Graduate school too, if you choose to pursue it. I'm not interested in punishing you for your parents' behavior, but I am interested in ensuring that you learn to value education and opportunity, rather than simply expecting to inherit wealth you didn't earn." Thomas made one last desperate attempt to negotiate some kind of compromise. "Mother, please. Even if you're determined to donate most of the money, surely you can see that completely cutting us out is excessive. We've made mistakes, but we're still your children. We still deserve some consideration." "You're absolutely right," I said, enjoying the moment of hope that flickered across his face before I crushed it completely. "You do deserve consideration, and you're getting exactly the consideration your behavior has earned. You've shown me that you value money more than relationships, entitlement more than gratitude, and your assumptions about my declining competence more than evidence of my continued success." I gestured toward the legal documents spread across the table. "The charitable donations represent about $12 million of the original $15 million in trust funds. The remaining $3 million will be distributed among the three of you equally, providing each family with a final payment of $1 million. Linda looked up sharply, suddenly interested despite her tears. $1 million each? That's still a substantial amount. Maybe we can work with that, restructure our plans around smaller expectations." "You misunderstand," I said with deliberate cruelty. "The $1 million per family comes with conditions. It will be distributed only after each of you has publicly apologized for your campaign to have me declared mentally incompetent. The apologies must be specific, acknowledging the hurtful and manipulative nature of your behavior over the past year." Daniel's face contorted with outrage. "You want us to humiliate ourselves publicly for money? That's blackmail." "It's accountability," I corrected. "You attempted to humiliate me by building a case for my mental incompetence. You conspired behind my back to take control of assets I earned through decades of hard work. Public acknowledgement of those actions seems like appropriate consequences." James added his legal perspective to the terms I was outlining. "The apology requirement is written into the modified trust documents as a condition for final distribution. It's completely enforceable and non-negotiable." Ashley was already calculating whether a public apology was worth $1 million to her family's financial situation. What kind of apology are we talking about? A letter to friends and family? A statement in the newspaper? A comprehensive acknowledgement of your behavior submitted to the Portland Business Journal for publication, I specified. An admission that you attempted to undermine my mental competence for financial gain, along with recognition that I remain fully capable of managing my own affairs. The requirement for public humiliation in Portland's business community was specifically designed to sting in a way that pure financial consequences might not. These were people who cared deeply about their social standing and professional reputations, and admitting publicly to their manipulation and greed would cost them more than money ever could. Helen returned from the kitchen carrying a tray with coffee and dessert, the normal conclusion to our family holiday gatherings. But the sight of pie and coffee in the midst of such dramatic family destruction seemed almost surreal, a reminder of how completely this Thanksgiving had departed from traditional expectations. "Will anyone be staying for dessert?" Helen asked with the kind of deadpan delivery that suggested she understood exactly how inappropriate the question was given the circumstances. Grace Williams was the only person who seemed capable of normal social interaction at that moment. "The pie looks wonderful, Helen. I'd love a small piece if others are interested." The mundane request for dessert broke some of the tension that had been building throughout my revelations, providing a moment for everyone to process what had happened and begin considering their responses to this new reality. Thomas was the first to make his decision about how to proceed. "I need to get home and discuss this with Ashley privately. We need time to think about everything that's been said here today." "Of course," I replied graciously. "Take all the time you need. The apology deadline is January 1st, so you have 5 weeks to decide whether public accountability is worth $1 million to your family." Linda was still staring at the legal documents as if they might transform into something more favorable if she looked at them long enough. "I can't believe this is really happening. I can't believe you're really willing to destroy our family over some perceived insults." "I'm not destroying anything," I said firmly. "I'm responding to destruction you created when you decided I was too old and confused to deserve basic respect. You chose to see me as an obstacle to your financial goals, rather than as a person with feelings and dignity." Patrick stood up and helped his wife gather her purse and coat, clearly eager to escape the increasingly uncomfortable situation. "Linda, we should go home and talk through our options. There's no point in continuing this discussion when everyone is emotional." Daniel remained seated, staring at his hands as if the answers to his financial problems might be written on his palms. "I don't understand how we got here. I don't understand how caring about your well-being turned into this kind of punishment." Dr. Foster, who had been observing the family dynamics with professional interest throughout the afternoon, chose this moment to provide some psychological perspective on what had transpired. "If I may offer an observation," she said diplomatically, "what I've witnessed today suggests a significant disconnect between intention and impact. You may have believed you were acting out of concern for your mother's well-being, but the effect of your actions was to undermine her autonomy and dignity. Sometimes caring requires stepping back and trusting people to make their own decisions, even when we disagree with those choices." Brandon and Sophia exchanged glances that conveyed an entire conversation about their parents' behavior and its consequences. They were old enough to understand the dynamics at play, and young enough to be embarrassed by the adults' conduct. "Can we still visit you, Grandma?" Sophia asked quietly. "I mean, even with everything that's happened with the money, we still love you and want to maintain our relationship." The question pierced through my anger and disappointment to touch the part of my heart that remained purely grandmother, rather than wounded family matriarch. "Of course you can visit. This conflict is with your parents, not with you. My door will always be open to you both." Frank Torres stood up and moved toward me with the slow deliberation of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions in challenging circumstances. "Maggie, I want you to know that Frank would be proud of what you did here today. He always said that respect had to be earned, not inherited, and that money without character was just a recipe for misery. His words carried special weight because of his long friendship with my late husband and his intimate knowledge of the values Frank and I had shared throughout our marriage. Having that validation from someone who had known us both for so long felt like a benediction on what had been a painful but necessary confrontation. James began gathering his papers and preparing to leave, his professional obligations completed for the day. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'll have final copies of all the documentation delivered to your home early next week. The charitable transfers will begin processing automatically, and the modified trust terms will take effect immediately." Grace Williams was practically glowing with excitement about the donations that would fund her foundation's work for years to come. "I can't thank you enough for this extraordinary gift. The board of directors will be thrilled, and I know the families we serve will be forever grateful for your generosity." As my family members began leaving one by one, the dining room that had been filled with tension and drama gradually returned to its normal, quiet elegance. Helen moved efficiently around the table, clearing away the remnants of what would undoubtedly become the most memorable Thanksgiving dinner in our family's history. Thomas paused at the front door, turning back to look at me with an expression that mixed anger, disappointment, and what might have been the beginning of understanding. "I hope you know what you've done, Mother. I hope you're prepared to live with the consequences of choosing charity over family." "I chose dignity over manipulation," I corrected. "I chose respect over entitlement. And I chose to use my money in ways that would make a positive difference in the world, rather than simply enabling the comfortable complacency of people who never learned to value what they had." After the front door closed behind the last of my departing family members, the house settled into a peaceful quiet that I hadn't experienced in months. The constant underlying tension of being observed and judged by people who questioned my mental competence was finally gone, replaced by the serene satisfaction of someone who had successfully defended her autonomy and dignity. Helen finished cleaning the dining room and joined me in the living room where I was sitting with a cup of coffee, watching the late afternoon light filter through the windows overlooking my garden. "How do you feel?" she asked simply. "Lighter," I said after thinking about it for a moment. "Sad about what I learned about my children's character, but lighter about not having to pretend anymore that their behavior was acceptable." She nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think any of them will write the apologies?" "Thomas will," I predicted. "His family's financial situation depends too heavily on that money for him to let pride get in the way. Linda probably will too, eventually, though she'll struggle with the public nature of it. Daniel is the wild card. He might decide that his artistic integrity is worth more than $1 million. Over the following weeks, news of my charitable donations spread through Portland's business and social communities, with the kind of velocity that accompanies really juicy gossip about wealthy families. The reactions were mixed but generally positive, with most people expressing admiration for my generosity, while speculating about what had motivated such a dramatic redistribution of family wealth. The Pediatric Cancer Center announcement made the front page of the Portland Business Journal, complete with quotes from hospital administrators about the transformational impact the donation would have on their ability to serve sick children. Reading about the concrete benefits my money would provide made every moment of family drama seem worthwhile. Thomas submitted his public apology 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, a carefully worded statement that acknowledged his misguided concerns about my mental competence while praising my business acumen and charitable spirit. It was clearly written by his lawyer rather than coming from his heart, but it met the technical requirements for releasing his family's portion of the remaining trust funds. Linda's apology arrived the day before the deadline, a more emotional piece that admitted to her role in questioning my judgment and expressed genuine regret for the pain her actions had caused. Whether that regret was sincere or motivated by financial necessity was debatable, but it satisfied the terms I had established. Daniel never submitted an apology. True to his artistic nature, he chose principle over profit, apparently deciding that maintaining his integrity was worth more than the money he would forfeit. I respected his choice, even as I felt sad about the permanent rift it created between us. 6 months later, I received a handwritten letter from Sophia thanking me for maintaining her college funding, despite everything that had happened with her parents. She was majoring in social work with plans to focus on helping disadvantaged children, a career choice that she said had been inspired by my charitable work. The letter filled me with hope that at least one member of the next generation had learned something positive from our family's dramatic Thanksgiving confrontation. Brandon visited regularly throughout his senior year, often bringing friends who were interested in learning about business and entrepreneurship. Our conversations were thoughtful and wide-ranging, covering everything from construction industry trends to philanthropy strategy. He seemed determined to build his own success, rather than relying on family money, an attitude that would have made his grandfather proud. The construction company continued to thrive under my leadership, with our sustainable building initiatives attracting national attention and new clients from across the country. The success provided definitive proof that my business judgment remained sharp, despite my advancing age, though I no longer felt the need to prove my competence to anyone. A year after that memorable Thanksgiving dinner, I received an unexpected phone call from Thomas asking if we could meet for lunch to discuss our relationship. He had spent the year in therapy, he told me, working through his attitudes about money, family, and aging. He wanted to apologize again, this time with genuine understanding of how his behavior had affected me. We met at a quiet restaurant in downtown Portland, and for the first time in years, we had a conversation that felt honest and real. He admitted that his fears about my aging had been mixed with anxiety about his own financial security in ways that had clouded his judgment about what was best for our family. He acknowledged that his attempts to control my decisions had been motivated more by his own needs than by genuine concern for my well-being. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. We agreed to rebuild our relationship slowly, with clear boundaries about my autonomy and his respect for my decisions. The money was gone and wouldn't be returned, but the possibility of restoring trust and affection remained if we were both willing to work for it. On my 74th birthday, Helen surprised me with a photo album documenting the impact of my charitable donations over the past year. Pictures of the new cancer treatment center under construction, scholarship recipients graduating from college, and families whose lives had been touched by the programs my money had funded filled page after page. It was a tangible reminder that wealth used wisely could create ripples of positive change that extended far beyond any individual family's comfort. The woman who had been called senile and incompetent at a Thanksgiving dinner had proven that she possessed not just mental sharpness, but moral clarity about how to use power and resources responsibly. The trust funds that were supposed to enable my children's comfortable futures instead became investments in causes that would benefit thousands of people who actually needed help. Sometimes the most important victories aren't about proving others wrong, but about proving to yourself that you have the strength to stand up for your values when it matters most. My family said I was senile at Thanksgiving, but by the time the turkey was carved and the truth was served, they discovered that this supposedly addled old woman still had quite a few surprises left in her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.